crazy. He tracked my location and caught me in the act on a beach. He did this next. Hello, Redditors. I'm about to talk about how I went from a perfect, successful daughter and a perfect wife to a person of disgrace and infidelity. My name is Freya. Please don't judge me too harshly as you listen to my story. I will try to tell it properly so you all can understand and maybe learn something from my greed. Yes, I was greedy and I paid for it dearly. My father had a look of absolute disgust on his face as he looked down at my kneeling frame from where he sat on his favorite seat in the living room of our family house. The whole family was present and I was in the middle of the circle that they formed, kneeling like a middle schooler on punishment, while they looked at me with disappointment and disgust as a recording played through my older brother's phone. It was a video, and the audio of the blasted video had a very familiar voice talking and moaning like a top-class witch in the background. My brother's phone was connected to a small Bluetooth player device so the whole house could hear it. My mother was crying and my 3 sisters looked about ready to slap me while my 2 brothers were probably planning to go find that man in the video and pummel him into the ground. Well, pummel me into the ground too, though. Yep. My father opened the family meeting by first pointing out that I was a disgrace to the family name and a stain to our lineage for my shameful actions and asking if I had anything to say for myself. I looked to the side in shame, biting on my lips hard enough to draw blood because I was ashamed of my actions and the shame of getting caught so horribly that even my family had become aware of my secret dealings. What led to this, you might be asking, so I'll give you a bit of the story. Winston and I were a couple. We had been married for 7 years and we had only 2 children, a pair of twins. We did not want more too soon because we were both ambitious youngsters who had tied the knot pretty early in life because we did not want to lose the other, but we were also not yet through with achieving our dreams and aspirations. So we decided to put childbearing on hold. I had gotten an IUD to prevent any errors, so I would not get pregnant before we were ready for any more kids, if we wanted more. And my husband was in full support of this. So I told my husband that I would be taking on overseas projects for my company that I was working in, because the returns were very attractive and I was certain of promotions and the likes if I went. My husband had looked at me skeptical about it and my decision too, and he voiced out his complaints about my choice. He had asked how sure I was that I would get the promotion in the end because it was not everyone that helped with international expansions of companies that got the promotions. He further explained that it might be my superior that ends up getting promoted after all my hard work, but I was adamant and assured him that I would work extra hard to get it for myself. My husband had looked like he was holding in a laugh at my words, but he suppressed the urge to burst into laughter at my little wholehearted speech and instead gave me words of encouragement, saying that he supported me and was rooting for me. I had teased him, saying that I would treat him to an expensive meal in a famous 5-star restaurant after I got my promotion, and my husband played along, saying that he was looking forward to my keeping the promise. All of this happened 3 days before I was supposed to leave home for the trip abroad. The trip was supposed to be an overseas trip to facilitate the expansion of the company. It was actually a branch of the company abroad, and I had been selected to help with the establishment of the branch and stabilize it for the next year. Of course, I would get chances to come home for breaks, every member of the team would, and I was grateful for that. But now that I look at it, I should have listened to my husband and refused to be part of the team that would go on the trip because it was on that particular trip that I met Xerxes. So it was the D-Day, and I was as giddy as I was in my junior year, excited for a school field trip. And my husband mentioned this, reminding me of a childhood picture of me that he had seen in my family album. Winston drove me to the airport where I was to meet my colleagues, and I kissed him goodbye, promising to call once I had landed, even as I waved enthusiastically while I made my way to where my colleagues were waiting for me. I made sure to call Winston as soon as I touched down, as promised, and he was very happy. Things were going so well as my team and I quickly got to work the very next day and set about putting things in order. After a struggling month, we were finally deemed ready to launch properly by the inspecting executives, so an official meeting was scheduled, and that was where I met Xerxes. Xerxes was an executive of the company. In fact, he had been one of the pioneers of the main branch, the headquarters of the company, and had traveled from headquarters to the new branch to secure the site and start construction and networking. Once Xerxes had finished with his task, he reported back to the headquarters to his fellow pioneers, who happened to be close friends of his. During the scheduled meeting, Xerxes kept staring at me like he knew me. His gaze was intense and too heated to be considered normal. I managed to make it through the meeting, and the executives in attendance were ushered by my direct superior to the reservation that had been for them, while I packed up and prepared for the company dinner for the staff. Just as the others left the room, Xerxes came back in, shutting and locking the door before he came close to me to speak. He stood so close to me, like we were in an intimate relationship, and it left me breathless and sweaty, and I could barely focus with all of the hot man aura enveloping me. Xerxes had said that he wanted us to meet again later in the evening after we had finished the board meeting, but I declined, stating that I had to attend the company dinner in the evening to get to know some of the other employees and not just the executives. Xerxes had looked at me incredulously, promising me that it would be much more interesting to spend the evening with him than with random strangers, and I had pointed out that he was also a stranger. Xerxes looked shocked but quickly recovered, saying that meeting him would give both of us the chance to get to know each other so we would not be total strangers anymore. He was quite the smooth talker, and I found my resolve crumbling, but I decided to stay strong, postpone the evil for another day. So I replied that I would see him on another evening because I did not want to miss the company dinner that night. Of course, he could tell that I was married. I always wore my wedding band, but Xerxes assured me that my marital status would not make a difference, and also that he had no intention of harming my marriage, and he could very well be in a relationship with me despite my marital status anytime, any day. He held me and murmured that I was even more beautiful than I had been when he had first seen me a year ago. I was taken aback, but there was this giddy feeling in my chest at the thought of such a fine specimen of man being so flirty with me. I had to fight the arousal that threatened to pass through me. I blurted out an excuse and ran out of the meeting room, all while Xerxes watched me, amused, and I left with my heart beating wildly in my chest. Xerxes was there at the venue of the company dinner, though he sat closer to the executives, while I helped my superior pass their orders to the waiters and helped with the drinks. I felt eyes on me, eyes which, not surprisingly, were Xerxes, tracking my every move like a hawk watching prey, and I felt a sudden thrill. It felt good to have someone so interested in me, and I loved it. To cut the long story short, I agreed to Xerxes' advances after the company dinner, and we fell into bed a week after, and I had my eyes open to new dimensions of pleasure, and all thoughts of Winston almost flew out of my head completely because Xerxes had it all. Power, money, fame, and physical traits that complemented me even more than Winston's. I entered into a relationship with Xerxes, and it was quite the beneficial relationship, if you ask me. Because like I said, Xerxes had the power and influence that I craved. He was essentially looking for a beautiful, trustworthy woman to hang off his arm as he secured partners at galas and parties, I'm sure. I began to hop planes, going on spontaneous trips and lying to Winston that I was going on business trips. Of course, I had gotten a promotion after my first trip abroad, and I used that as the perfect excuse to travel out of the country or city, whichever was the case when Xerxes was involved, as I pleased, which was quite frequently. I think that was when Winston may have begun to feel left out or neglected. I tried to cover up and tie the loose ends at home by pretending to be extra needy whenever I was home with Winston, and initiating intimacy more often, sort of like an apology for leaving him high and dry too much. But it was also to sell the frankly obvious lie that the overseas trips were making me needy, and that I missed Winston so much. Winston asked me one night to take it easy, but I had gotten defensive and told him that I needed to work like that to feed my ambitions, and to stop the feeling of inferiority and being useless from eating me up. I even cried in his arms, and Winston had spent hours comforting me. It hurt somewhere in my chest at my actions, but I stumped the feeling down so quickly that it was almost like it never popped up in the first place, and continued with my act. Winston had assured me that it would all be fine and that he would support me no matter what decision I took, and he would be around to help me up if I ever broke down or anything. I was actually not overworked. I was quite relaxed and well pampered by Xerxes, the very wealthy and adventurous Xerxes who spoiled me rotten, and I could not get enough of him or his wealth and power. It was around a year into my adventure that my tricks began to get old and started to work less and less. Winston got smarter, and it started to show. Winston started to show less support for my work, often expressing his displeasure in my leaving home for weeks on end and returning sometimes exhausted, sometimes with suspiciously new and extravagant things. One night, all my secrets came to light, and that's how I got here in the first place, with my family looking at me. My husband began to give details of my affair with Xerxes, details that I was certain that only Xerxes himself and I were privy of, and I started to shake and cry. Winston had a notebook with detailed entries with dates and activities that had my parents' eyes bulging wide open. My brothers looked disgusted, and my sisters were beyond embarrassed. No one wanted to hear about how their sibling was frolicking with some rich sugar daddy. My father just shook his head and asked Winston to continue. He wanted to hear it all, wanted the family to hear it all. And I had to know too. My husband had put a tail on me, and quite the meticulous one, that provided him with pictures, short footages, and his notebook or journal had these details carefully penned down, and I began to wonder how and where he had hidden such a distinct book that I had not seen before. I found out that the tale had been someone who could access the exclusive venues I went with Xerxes to, and also the private areas Xerxes could enter too, and it was my husband's doing. He had paid quite the hefty amount for it from our joint account, which I did not even suspect with how much money was rolling into my private accounts from Xerxes, and new connections I had made in the course of my relationship with Xerxes. The tales fed my husband the details of all my movements and arrangements. I had gotten careless because I felt that with Xerxes I could do anything, but I had forgotten that before Xerxes I was just a simple woman who could and definitely would have eyes following her, while Xerxes was an untouchable man who nothing he did could come back to bite him. The dreaded tape was of my most recent trip with Xerxes to a certain private island that Xerxes had purchased to entertain business partners, and also for him to relax on personal holidays. I had told my husband that the company had assigned me to another overseas job, to oversee another branch that had been established abroad, and that following my supposed promotion, which was actually true. I remember Winston giving me a deadpan expression, a look of disgust passing across his features so quickly that I did not see it properly because it did not stay long, before he suddenly gave a weak smile and told me that he would be rooting for me. I tried to sell the lie and asked if he could see me off again like the last 2 times, but he said he had an early day on the day of my trip, and if things don't go well, he might have to work overtime on the day before my trip.
No.
Winston had asked me after one of my trips if I was open to having more children, but I remember that I had brushed him off, stating that my work life was too hectic with my promotion and increased duties to have a child. I had argued that the stress alone would be capable of endangering a pregnant, talk less of the child, that I might not be able to breastfeed like my first 2. In actuality, it was because a pregnancy would lead to my relationship with Xerxes ending too soon, and I needed to keep using the influence I got from being with Xerxes until I could get enough of what my greed craved. I still needed to get more money and power. I still wanted to be recognized. My husband admitted that he had not really received the video as he had earlier stated. He explained that he had been following me, and that he had filmed Xerxes and I himself, so the tape was an original one, and he showed my father his phone to prove this. My mother leaned over at my father's side to take a look at the phone, and I watched her eyes roll to the back of her head, and she promptly passed out on the couch, thankfully falling against my father on the couch. My father, overcome by rage, shifted my mother into my oldest sister's lap and stood up from the couch. He approached me menacingly, and I only heard his hand sail through the air. I did not really see his hand till it connected with my cheek, leaving a big, red, stinging bruise on my flushed skin. It took everything I had to keep myself from crying. I looked up at my dad and saw the man looking at me with such anger and hatred that I wanted to shrink and disappear into thin air from fear. And don't get me started in what my siblings look like right now, with the eldest daughter fanning our panting mother with a hand fan and staring daggers at me from where she sat with our mother. The sound of Winston clearing his throat brought me out of my thoughts, and I looked just as everyone turned to look at the man with the most hatred burning in his eyes. Winston simply stated that he wanted a divorce, and my heart sank, literally dropped into my stomach, and I began to cry and protest, earning flabbergasted looks and equal looks of disgust in the process. It was not like I could lie, though. My only argument there was that I would end things with Xerxes and even leave the job at the company and do just about anything for Winston to trust me again, and not go ahead with the divorce he had just spoken of. But Winston just shook his head, demanding to know which world I had thought such a thing could happen, and I was rendered speechless. My mother had woken up at this point and just stared at me with a look that translated as, "What in the name of all things holy are you going on about?" I tried again, assuring Winston that I would do anything. Heck, I even confessed that the time Winston had apparently captured on tape was supposed to be the last time I would ever have to meet Xerxes. I tried to explain that it was something like a contract, and I was already going to end it even before Winston found out. Winston raised a brow and asked me to explain further, to which I replied that I was not lying, and I really had no intention of doing anything with Xerxes anymore, to which Winston only laughed, a hoarse, dry thing that was anything but amused or anything like that. That laugh was one of disbelief and incredibly mocking. Winston asked if I was tripping or if I was just that dense, saying that the trust he had in me was already broken, and any confidence he had in my faithfulness was already gone for good, and all that was left was simply a husk of the former love, if what was left of his feelings for me could even be called love at this point. I was speechless at this, and I just looked up at him as he squatted down to be near eye level with me as he said all that. I ended up stuttering that I would do nothing of sort ever if Winston agreed to take me back. I was looking to my family for any sort of backup, but they all just looked at me disappointedly, shaking their heads at me, and I realized that I was all on my own. I was quite literally done for here. Winston sighed and rubbed his face, shaking his head at me before he got to his knees in front of me and held onto my shoulders, holding me steady as he looked straight into my eyes with the coldest expression I had ever seen in my life. And then Winston was wiping my eyes with his palms and petting my cheeks, and I began to shake at his actions, my whole body trembling in what I could only interpret as fear, especially when Winston was touching me. There was no sign of affection in his movements and gestures at all. Winston told me that crying would actually do nothing to help, and that I should quit it with the begging because he would soon get angry enough to hit me, and he did not want to hit a woman, especially one as physically delicate as I was, since he did not want to add to the throbbing that Xerxes' hard pounding had caused my body to have. It was mocking. Winston's tone was absolutely, completely downright mocking, and I saw my father wince from the corner of my eye. Winston went on to tell me that the divorce papers had already been prepared, and all it needed to become valid were the signatures, and it would be in my best interest to sign so we could get the marriage annulled as quickly as possible so we could go our separate ways. Winston got up after his cold words, and turned to face my family. He bowed to my father, who asked him to get up, saying that there was no need since the family had disgraced Winston, but Winston shook his head, saying that respect to elders is due, and he bore no grudge against the family in general. He only hates me and not the family as a whole. My parents thanked him for this, and my older brothers and father saw him out, escorted him to the front door, and watched him drive off, no doubt to get the divorce papers. Just as Winston left, my family turned to me and I felt a panic rise in me. I had to shift back a bit because I was scared, and I did not know what to expect with the looks I was getting from everyone. My mother had somewhat recovered and was ready to face me, to look at me. See, the full details of my blunder came out fully along with the divorce papers around 2 weeks later, in the presence of both my family and my in-laws, Winston's immediate family. The biggest disgrace I had ever experienced in my life, sitting on my knees in the middle of the beautifully decorated living room of my in-laws, with the wedding dress that I had inherited from my lovely mother-in-law, as they all watched me and waited for me to sign the divorce papers, all while they were listening to what Winston had to say. Yes, a strange turn of events, but it was something that had to happen to ensure that I faced enough humiliation to begin to atone for my sins. Winston began to narrate after the papers, already bearing Winston's signature, had been placed in front of me. On the day the video had been shot, I and Xerxes were out on the patio behind the luxury mansion he had on his private island. No guests to entertain this time, so it was Xerxes, myself, and his helpers on the island. Helpers that he shooed away after they had served us our meals so Xerxes and I could have some alone time. The woman was obviously me. I did not like to wear my engagement ring after my wedding, as I preferred my wedding band because I did not want the bulk on my finger, so my husband had gotten new rings and modified them so we could use them as an alternative. From the angle of the video and how the camera seemed to be shaking a lot, and the sound of labored breathing, it sounded like whoever had shot the video was panicking, or maybe the shock was getting to the cameraman. Well, the person behind the camera was angry, and the shaking was from shock and anger mixing dangerously together into one. Winston was the cameraman. Winston had followed me to the airport without my knowledge. He had watched me get on a different flight from the team from the office. That is, he had watched me dodge the group and move to wait for another plane. I had booked a completely different flight. Winston had gotten on the next plane headed towards my new destination almost right after I had left, and he had his contact. The tail followed me closely till he arrived in the country I was headed, and once the tail had gotten the details of where I was headed, from the taxi I had boarded, which was taking me to a small hangar on the outskirts of the actual city where I had touched down. Xerxes was waiting for me there with his private helicopter that would take us to his private island just off the coast for us to spend the month or so that I was supposed to be gone. Winston couldn't follow us by air, so he had gotten a boat from another contact of his to follow us, but not too closely else he was discovered. We touched down on a helipad on the island, and Xerxes was there to welcome me while he signaled to his helpers to help me with my luggage. Winston had an insider in the island home. One of the live-in stewards was a friend, and had been the one who hid Winston for an entire week while he monitored me and gathered all of the evidence. Winston had watched me when he could and had the steward he knew watch me when he couldn't be there. He had seen me being all lovey-dovey with another man and enjoying myself in another man's arms, watching me enjoy pleasures and luxury while I was deceiving him and frolicking around with a man. Winston had headed back home after around a week of surveillance and confirming for himself the information his contact had given him. and also getting the video that would serve as definite evidence. He has gone home via the boat that had brought him to the island, as well as the first flight home, and he waited patiently for 2 weeks to pass, picking up the phone whenever I made a routine call to ask how he was doing, like I usually did when I actually went on work trips, or rather when I left the house just to keep up the good wife act. It was around a week before I was supposed to be back home that I had gotten a bunch of calls, frantic, urgent calls from home, from my parents and siblings ordering me to head to the family house as soon as I touched down, suitcase and suit on without any need to go home and change. Which would bring us back again to the previous situation where I had been on my knees back in my family house as my tape player in the background, and I walked into the living room to see a live action of myself bouncing on a man's lap, outdoors, on an island. And then there's the current situation, where my activities are once again revisited, but in the presence of not just my family, but also my in-laws. It was at the end of the video in Winston's narration, his clear evidence of my sins, that he finally looked me in the eye and frowned, which caused me to flinch and almost back away at the coldness in his eyes. Coldness that told of a man who was done with me and had erased me from his mind.
Yeah, good.
He rolled his eyes at me and took his seat again while my father cleared his throat but did not say anything for a while. Just looked at me and then my mother before he finally spoke. He started by asking me if I understood where everything was going, to which I nodded a yes, and he nodded back before turning to face Winston and my in-laws. My father started with an apology before going on to say that he was not aware that the child he had raised and whose hand he had given in marriage to an innocent man who went well would turn out like this and bring shame to both families. He asked that my in-laws bore no grudge, and that they should consider my kneeling before them, and the divorce is the first step towards an apology, which although would not be able to gloss things over at all, would still be a step towards peace. He explained that he did not want Winston's family to look upon mine in a negative light, and that I would be the one to carry my sins, but that for the sake of friendship and the bond we had formed as family on the day I married Winston, that the matter should be settled with a clean divorce, which would have the full blessing of the families and any other punishment they deemed fitting for me. Winston's father nodded at this and said that he did not hate anyone. He was only sad that his child had gotten his heart shattered by the very woman that he adored, and that it was obvious that a divorce was the logical cause of action since it was what Winston wanted, what he had pushed for. My father-in-law also said that since my father had given his permission, I would also face a punishment by Winston's family to atone for my sins, and then he was looking at me, both men, my father and Winston's. I nodded at them before I thought better of it, and I said that I would take the punishment and bowed as an afterthought, which thankfully seemed to please both men, so I was signaled to sign the divorce papers, which I quickly did, the pen scratching on the paper as I added my signature and full name, maiden name to it, and raised my head, raising it up for them to see and for Winston to take. Winston took it and put it back in the envelope while I was sort of just ignored in favor of everyone present speaking to each other, while I just continued to kneel, enduring the shame that washed over my entire being. I could not help the urge that came over me to bow my head again and sob and cry silently as I continued to deliberate on my matter. To cut the long story short, after that very eye-opening dose of shame and humiliation, I was asked to go and get my things and move back to my family home with immediate effect. Since I had signed the papers, I would need to face my punishment immediately as soon as possible, which was actually a light and simple thing, considering that Winston had taken the time to pack up and arrange my suitcases and all my luggage for me. He thankfully did not take the car that we had bought for me together. He had told me to consider it a sort of parting gift and a thank you for the initial love and the good memories. I felt tears sting my eyes once again, but I stumped it down, blinking hard and nodding my head instead of answering him with words for fear that my voice might crack if I tried to speak. Winston gave me a strange look, observed me as I loaded all of my stuff into the car. I was told that I could keep the ring since I was quitting my job. I could sell the more expensive one and keep me for a bit while I found a new job. Winston only said goodbye to me and stated that the next time we would be meeting would be in court to finalize the divorce, and also another family meeting since my punishment had been decided, but it was not in his place to tell me. I agreed and left, looking back at Winston as he went back into the house that I once called home but could not any longer. Update. So yeah, like I said before and like you might have seen, I messed up really badly and now I am nothing short of a disgrace to womanhood. I mean, who would cheat on their husband so carelessly and be caught and disgraced to the point of becoming the subject of the family meeting, up to the extended family even? So, like I mentioned, the divorce was a very quick affair and my family was in support. That is, they gave their full support. blessings and they advocated for custody of the children to be given to my husband, ex-husband, and that I would have no more say in anything relating to the children's life other than stipulated visits issued by the courts on weekends that my husband would choose himself. Yes, as unbelievable as that sounds. It wasn't the court that decided that I stay out of the children's life, though. It was a unanimous agreement between my family and that of my husband to keep me from corrupting the children. Winston said he would let me see the children during holidays, but he did not want me anywhere near the children before then. Before holidays. But if I was visiting or if the children were to visit, it would be in my family house under the close observation of my parents or my siblings. At least someone older than me had to be in the room. Of course, I disagreed with this absurd and beyond abnormal development, but I was quickly shut down when Winston asked me if I really wanted to see the children or not. Xerxes is a thing of the past. I didn't see him anymore and he didn't contact me. Crossed my heart, but Winston never forgave me, no matter how much I tried to get back in his good graces. Not to remarry, though, but to at least be allowed to be closer to the children again. But I was turned down, even by my family. The children were no doubt mine, but I would only be a bystander in raising them. Winston, my family, and my former in-laws would play the major roles in their upbringing. I might as well have become a distant aunt of theirs. Winston reminded me that I was the one who had made my bed, and I would have to lay on it as I had made it. It was too late for regrets, and I cannot turn back time. I was unhappy, and I was essentially a zombie at work, moving on autopilot, all while I still worked to deal with the settlement I was supposed to pay to my husband and his family, though not a verdict of the court, but a family tradition in the event of divorce, because it was my fault that the marriage had ended in a divorce. So I would be the one settling the family, and my family was in support of this, since I needed to pay my dues. Of course, the settlement money was coming from my paycheck and also from the money I had stockpiled during my time with Xerxes. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I just hadn't been a sucker for Xerxes' sweet talk and charms, if I hadn't been such a sucker for wealth and so power-hungry. I sometimes wonder how Xerxes was doing on most days, since I had called the whole thing off so abruptly and had changed my number and also resigned from the company to find a new job elsewhere, a step to showing my parents that I was ready to change and do right. It would not be hard for a man like Xerxes to find me, but I would rather enjoy my time of freedom before he would ultimately come find me and probably ruin it. But until then, I'd just do the needful. He caught me in the act. I did a lot of things I was not meant to do, but there's nothing I can do again. I made a mistake. Now I am facing the trauma. My name is Victoria, and I am 25 years old. I work in a small restaurant downtown. It isn't much, but I'm grateful for what I have. The name of my husband is Pascal. Pascal is 30 years old, and he is a businessman. Pascal and I have been married for over 3 years now. Pascal and I met at the restaurant where I work. It was love at first sight for him. I just liked Pascal casually initially, but as time went on, I had to just settle for him because he was very much accommodating and he had stability, which I wanted. It was like every other day, and I was working late at the restaurant when a customer came in, and it was Pascal. He was very charming, and he was a very interesting guy. We exchanged numbers, and we went on several dates. I enjoyed dating Pascal for a while. Indeed, we had our differences, like we could quarrel, argue, but we could always find our way to each other. It wasn't long Pascal had introduced me to his family. They were very lovely, and they accepted me wholeheartedly. His mother was very accommodating. It wasn't long after that before Pascal proposed to me, and we began preparing for our wedding. We got married in the most simple way. It was very beautiful. 2 months into our marriage, I found out that marriage is not a bed of roses. It was really tough at first because I was living with someone and I was seeing the person every day, so it became so boring for me. But then I spoke to Pascal about it and we worked it out. At first, Pascal didn't take it lightly. He was very disappointed at first, but through therapy sessions that we attended, we worked it out and I knew I was not really invested like I thought. Our therapist had advised us that we should try to be very spontaneous in our relationship. So Pascal and I did all that and we were able to rekindle our relationship. Pascal and I managed to talk our problems out and he had informed me that it was time for us to have a child. I didn't want to be a joy killer, but I knew I wasn't ready for that, coupled with the problems we were facing. I knew that we were trying to work out our differences, but putting a child into the midst of all this was suicide. But I didn't want to address it, and so I avoided the topic. It was like every other day I was at work when I received a call from Pascal telling me that his mom was organizing a small intimate family dinner and we had to attend. I knew I was busy that day and I wouldn't be able to attend. I had to explain the situation at work to Pascal, but he didn't believe me. He kept going on and on about how I was not paying attention to him and how I was giving more importance to my work rather than giving him more attention. Pascal kept going on and on about how his family was important to him, and I was not respecting that. I just felt like Pascal was about to start something which wasn't really necessary. I loved his family, and I believed they loved me too. I didn't know where all these side comments were coming from. Pascal can be very petty. He usually holds on to little things. When I knew that I was genuinely tired of everything, I had to report Pascal to his parents. I missed the dinner that his mom had planned, and I explained to them the reason why I missed the dinner. They understood where I was coming from, and they didn't make a fuss about it. I told them that Pascal had changed and he was not the man I fell in love with and married. I told them that Pascal usually throws tantrums at every little thing, which is really exhausting. But at his parents' home, I received the biggest shock of my life. Pascal used my words against me. Pascal had left me out to dry by telling his parents that I was the problem because he had wanted children, and I was not ready to have them. Pascal threw me completely under the bus, and it wasn't fair. I thought that was our own problem that we were supposed to discuss on our own without bringing in a third party. I didn't know how to feel at that moment. His parents and his siblings began seeing me very differently. It was as if I was the one who was holding their family's happiness. But I knew within my heart I wasn't going to bring a child into the mist. Where both parents had unresolved issues, definitely the child is going to suffer for it. After that day at Pascal's home, his family had pushed me aside, but I knew that I didn't really care. I moved on with my life, and I was just going about my work and my business. But I knew I had to solve the problems I had with Pascal because at the end of the day, he was my husband and I loved him. I was able to sit down with Pascal one faithful day, and I convinced him that we were going to have children one way or the other, but not right at that moment because we needed to plan things and put certain things in order. Pascal's business at that point was not doing well, and so I told him that we needed to put in extra work in order to have a good future for our child. He saw reasons with me and he agreed to it. And I actually saw the changes in Pascal. He began to look for more work because his own business wasn't really moving. I was somehow happy because I felt like finally my husband, who I had dated, was back to me. I knew it was a step in the right direction, even if I knew I was deceiving him then. I was really ready to have a child, but if this lie I was telling could bring the Pascal I knew once before, I was fine with it. Pascal and I did a lot of activities together. We went on dates, and he made me happy in a lot of ways. Pascal was invited to a colleague's wedding anniversary party, and he decided to take me along. It was a nice party. We danced at the party. I got to meet some of his friends who are close to him, and they received me so nicely. I got to mingle at the party. I met some amazing group of girls there. We immediately clicked, and we became friends. We planned to meet up after the party, and we did. We met up at a nice place, and we talked about a lot of things. They were all radiating positive energy, which I somehow needed at that point. We talked about everything. The one I was very close to was Esther. Esther was very easygoing, very loud, and very beautiful. It was really nice to get to know her. At that point, she was already my best friend. I felt like she understood me, and I also understood her. I had finally found someone I could speak to because there are days I want to just rant to someone in order for me to be relieved. I was happy because Esther was already my friend. She was just a funny soul. It was like every other day, and I was trying to get hold of Pascal because he had traveled for work and he was out of town. When I got hold of him, we talked for some time, and I got ready for work. On getting there, I found out that there had been a fire outbreak at the restaurant, and immediately I became very exhausted. This restaurant had been able to put food on my table ever since I was in college, and the old couple that had the restaurant meant a lot to me. I went home and I began to cry because I knew that I had lost my job and there was no hope of getting another one. I immediately tried to reach Pascal, but it was not connecting, and I decided to call Esther. She came as soon as she could, and I was very happy because she gave me a lot of comfort. She was able to cheer me up, and I was somehow relieved. I trusted Esther to make me laugh. It wasn't long when Pascal had called me. I explained everything to him, and he also comforted me, telling me he was going to come very soon so he could be with me. Weeks after the incident, when Pascal had returned, he told me that he was going to look for another job for me, but I had already started looking for another job. I didn't want to depend on my husband for anything, and I knew that he was happy about that. He wanted me to just stay home and be a housewife. So when he told me he had been looking for a job for me, I didn't really believe him. With the help of Esther, I was able to get another job. The pay wasn't much, but it was definitely okay. At least I wasn't going to be just staying at home. I decided to go see the old couple that owned the restaurant that got burnt, and I sympathized with them because somehow they had become my family. A few months later, I was already settling into my new job. It was going smoothly, and Esther had told me she wanted to take me and my husband to dinner. I accepted the invitation and I told Pascal about it. He had never met Esther, but I had told him a lot about her. I introduced them on that day and we got right into ordering our food. I excused myself to go to the restroom when I bumped into a guy coming out from the men's room. I apologized immediately and he told me to forget about it. He complimented me and our conversation started from there. He told me he was into the restaurant business and I decided to exchange numbers with him. He told me his name was Elijah. We talked for some minutes and Esther came looking for me and I had to leave. I went to the restroom and came out. Esther asked me about Elijah and I brushed it off. We had dinner and we talked for a while. The next day I received a call from Elijah inviting me to his restaurant in order for me to check a few things. After work I went over there and I was amazed. Elijah was really into the restaurant business and he was also a chef. He showed me around and his restaurant was really lovely. Elijah told me that he was looking to expand and since I had experience in the field he wanted me to work at his new branch. I told him that he didn't know me and he was planning to entrust his business in my hand. He told me I was good at it and that he believed in me. I told Elijah that I was going to think about it and get back to him. I went home very happy and I told my husband about it. Pascal wasn't happy that a random guy was about to help me. I told him that he should be very happy for me because I saw a job that was going to pay me good money. He told me he was only going to allow me to take the job if I let him meet Elijah. I told him that it wasn't his decision to make, but in order for peace to reign and for my own peace of mind, I decided to ask Elijah if he would want to meet up with my husband before I could accept the job. Elijah agreed, and he told me when he was going to be less busy, and I set up the meeting. Elijah made me draw out the menu for the restaurant, and preparation was underway. I did everything needed for the opening of the restaurant down to the decor, the cottons, and all. It felt like I was opening my own restaurant. It felt so surreal. Elijah and Pascal finally met, and I was grateful to Elijah for putting the mind of Pascal at rest because he thought there was something going on between me and Elijah. But Elijah was just straightforward, and he told Pascal that it was just business, nothing more. We opened the restaurant and it was very beautiful. People loved our food and they kept tripping. Overall, it was really good. Money was coming in and Elijah was very happy. He gave me a huge salary and a good bonus. I was really grateful because it looked like a dream come true. A few weeks after the opening, Elijah had told me he wanted to take me out to celebrate because I had brought more money for him through the branch I was heading to. I was also very happy because everything about me changed completely. I could afford anything I wanted and it looked like my husband wasn't happy for me. He was always so cold to me anytime I was discussing work or anything related to Elijah. He could always say he was not interested. And when I told him about the dinner that Elijah had invited me to, he became very angry and I didn't really care because it was my turn to shine and I wasn't going to let anyone dim it. I got ready and I left for dinner. I came outside and there was a car waiting for me. I felt so happy and I left for the dinner. Elijah and I met up and I told him how grateful I was for the pampering and he told me it was nothing. We had a lovely dinner. The food was nice and the ambience was wonderful. A few minutes into the dinner, Elijah kept moving in a certain way that I didn't understand. He was very gentle with me and I brushed it off because he had told my husband that he didn't see me as anything more than just a friend. I went home that day and I didn't find Pascal at home. I called his phone, but it was unreachable. I became worried because it was unlike him to switch off his phone. I decided not to panic and so I called Esther to talk to her about how I spent my evening. She had told me how happy she was for me and how jealous of all the fun I was having without her. Esther had traveled for the weekend to go see her mom. The next day, Pascal came home smelling like cheap perfume and alcohol. I asked him where he had been all night, and he told me it wasn't any of my business. I didn't know when I started crying because I knew he had cheated on me because I knew deep in my gut. I didn't know where I had gone wrong to be treated in such a way by my husband. That day, I went to work feeling so low. I decided not to let that weigh me down, and I went so hard at work. I occupied my mind till it was time for lunch when I received a bundle of flowers from someone. At first, I thought it was Pascal that was trying to apologize to me, but when I saw that it wasn't from him, I was a little bit disappointed. But I received a call from Elijah asking me if I liked the flowers. I was a little bit cheered up by his gesture, and I thanked him for it. I went about with the rest of the day, and when it was time for me to go home, I went home and I saw Pascal passed out on the ground. I immediately called for help, and he was taken to the hospital. I was very worried about him. A few hours later, the doctor had told me it was an alcohol overdose and he should stay away from alcohol for some time. The Pascal family came as soon as they could, and I explained everything to them too. We were all waiting for him to regain consciousness. I was exhausted from work, but I had no choice but to stay at the hospital overnight. I called Elijah and told him about what was happening and that I was going to take some time off to take care of him. He agreed, and I found one of my assistants to take care of the restaurant before I resumed. A couple of hours later, Pascal woke up and the doctors checked on him and they said he was okay to go home. They asked me to take very good care of him and that he should stay off alcohol for some time. We went home and I had to have a sit-down talk with Pascal and his parents. They asked him the reason why he had resulted in drinking. He said that his business was doing well and that he was very broke. I had to explain to him that that shouldn't give him the right to drink himself to death. But he wouldn't even listen to me and his parents weren't helpful, so I excused myself. The next day I had a conversation with him that I was able to convince Elijah to give him a push in the right direction, and he was going to get the job, but he said I shouldn't do anything like that, and that he was not going to accept anything from Elijah. He got angry and walked out of the house. I decided that I was going to invite Elijah over in order for him to talk sense into Pascal, but as I was trying to reach him, it wasn't going through. After a few hours, he called me and he told me he was free and he could show up to my house in the evening. I kept on waiting for Pascal, but he didn't show. Out of frustration, I decided to have a few drinks. Elijah came over and I explained everything that had been happening to him and how my husband needed help. He agreed to help Pascal and I was happy. Far into our conversation, I discovered that I was already tipsy. One thing left to another and Elijah and I kissed. It escalated from that to us ending up on the bed. I was so lost in what we were doing that I didn't know that Pascal had walked in. Pascal dragged Elijah and they both started fighting. I started screaming and calling our neighbors for help. The fight ended up with Pascal severely injured. I tried to help him, but he refused my help. Pascal asked me to leave the house because he needed space, and I respected his decision and I left with Elijah. Pascal can be very destructive if he is angry as we were leaving. I could hear him destroying things and I immediately felt bad. I did want to think about my marriage at that point because I knew it was a lot to take in at once. I asked Elijah if he genuinely had feelings for me and he said he did. The next day I went about my work in the restaurant. Elijah was kind enough to open the doors of his house to me. I was planning that by the end of work I could go back home to get a few of my things. I got there and I met Pascal's family there and they were all insulting about how I was very cheap and all. I tried to get to Pascal in order for me to speak with him, but they wouldn't let me. It was all too exhausting, and so I decided I was going to have a conversation with him if he was alone. A few days later, I received a package, and inside were my divorce papers. I didn't know where I started crying. I tried to call Pascal, and when he picked, he threatened me on how he was going to make my life very miserable. He had told me he was going to make me regret ever cheating on him. I told him that I didn't mean to cheat and that it was all a mistake, but he ignored me and he switched off his phone. I went to Elijah's house that day and I cried like never before. My foolishness had made me lose my marriage. I started to regret all the wrong decisions I made regarding my relationship and marriage to Pascal. The following day, I went to our house and I was told that the house had already been sold. I called Pascal, but he ignored my calls. I was able to track him down to his family house, and at that place, I begged Pascal to please reconsider and also for us to work out our differences. But all my pleadings went to deaf ears. I went back to Elijah's house telling him I was already tired of crying and that it was time for me to sign the divorce papers and never look back. I got a lawyer and he went through it and we discovered that Pascal was planning to take everything we built all for himself. The house we bought he sold without telling me, and now all the properties we acquired together he took everything for himself, and he left me nothing. I told my lawyers that I was not ready to fight any divorce. I signed the papers and I was done with Pascal and his baggage and I was freed. I moved on from him and I concentrated on expanding my restaurant business, which was growing with the help of Elijah. Update. Hello guys, so I was able to leave the marriage without anything. Everything I ever worked for Pascal claimed it was all his and he didn't leave anything to me. I didn't want to fight him because honestly I was exhausted. His drama was too much. Pascal held on to something that had happened while I was drunk and he refused to forgive me. I genuinely loved Pascal and I was trying to make our relationship work. I didn't plan for what happened, but it did. I made up my mind that I wasn't just going to take a step back and wallow. I decided to make something good out of everything. Elijah and I agreed that it was okay for us to just stay friends and not compromise our work relationship. He apologized for how the marriage turned out and I told him it wasn't his fault. We have remained friends ever since and together we have opened more restaurants. Pascal's revenge on me was so cruel he literally turned everything against me. Sometimes the trauma is so fresh in my head I wished I never got into any form of relationship with Pascal. He was very cruel to me and I knew I didn't deserve any of that.